This content is on operationalization, or creating operational definitions for your dependent variable. So just a review of independent and dependent variable. Imagine that we have this hypothesis that people who stare at a distant point on the horizon for 3 minutes will have more peace of mind than people who focus on a nearer point for 3 minutes. So our independent variable, or IV, is focal point. Is the focal point distant, or is it near? We're asking people, or we're manipulating where they place their focal point for 3 minutes, either looking at something far away or something close, and then we're going to measure peace of mind. And so we know that focal point is the IV because the researcher manipulated it or assigned individual to one of those two conditions. And we know that DV, peace of mind, is the DV, dependent variable, because the researchers measured it and believe it will depend on the focal point. A second example, adolescent girls who attend a difficult puberty ceremony will have lower menstrual pain than adolescent girls who attend an easier puberty ceremony. Our independent variable is difficulty. Either the ceremony is difficult or it's easier. The researcher in this study might be randomly assigning, or might just be taking girls who had different traditions. The DV, or dependent variable, is menstrual pain. Now, dependent variables are super important. You should all think very hard about your dependent variable because this is the key focus of your study. This is the variable that's so important that you've decided to measure it, to see if your independent variable change it. Your dependent variable means something to you. It makes a difference. So think carefully about it. In the examples we've gone through, the Good Samaritan study, for example, the dependent variable helpfulness was measured. And remember, they measured it in the conditions of somebody being late or not late. And that they measured it because helpfulness was important. They had seen Kitty Genovese get murdered. Nobody had helped. Why? And so they felt it was important. That's why they chose it. In the Ash conformity study, conformity was measured. They were bringing this work to the forefront after World War II, in which people had, turned in their neighbors who were Jewish and watched them be tortured. And Ash wondered, how could people do this? How could they conform with this when it was so wrong? And so again, Ash and colleagues thought conformity was really important. And in the car crash study, the variable speed estimate was measured. And it probably wasn't that important how well people estimate speeds. And so they were using it as a proxy measure for accuracy, with the idea that the way questions were phrased, were they biased or were they unbiased, would actually change the way people perceived something like speed of a traveling car. And so each of these dependent variables were important for the reasons stated, and the same needs to be true for your dependent variable. So in one of our students in our class, we teased this out a little bit. She's interested also in the Canalda ceremony, and in order to figure out what she might measure, we asked, what do you feel was the outcome of your Canalda ceremony? And some of the things that came up were immediate outcomes were a sense of identity and perhaps self-esteem and dignity, acceptance for being an adult woman. And long-term outcomes might have been deeper meaning and groundedness. So this student might wish to examine one or more of these variables as the dependent variable in her study. Another student in our class was interested in whether it made a difference if you listen to music while you're painting. And when asked, what difference does music make to you, she said, oh, motivation. She feels more motivated when she's painting. And so she is likely, sorry about that, and so she is likely to choose that motivation as the dependent variable in her study. But the problem with dependent variables in psychology is that they're often constructs. And by constructs, we mean that we have ideas in our heads that can't be measured with physical means. So for example, well-being might be a dependent variable that you think is important, but what is it exactly? We don't have a ruler to measure it, or a measuring cup, or a scale. How do we measure it? It consists of things like physical health, happiness, mental health, social connectedness, meaningfulness. How are we going to measure that? Or the variable creativity, that's tough. It might consist of like one's ability to synthesize or flow, adapt, draw unique conclusions, make connections. How are we going to measure it? Some variables aren't constructs, and they're simple to measure. Age is a variable, easy. We measure it in years. Weight, easy. We measure it in pounds. We have scales. But these psychological constructs are tougher. So we need to operationalize them or make some decisions about how to measure them. This is because constructs are not observable. We might be able to see the way a creative person behaves in certain situations, but they're not immediately observable the way we can look at a at a scale or a clock to measure time. So here's a couple examples. So again, operationalizing is determining a process or tool through which you can systematically connect data on processes and phenomena that aren't observable, like constructs. So social anxiety is a construct, and let's say we think it's very important. Maybe someone we love experiences social anxiety and it puts a real damper on their life. But we can't really measure it. We can't put a thermometer in it or anything and come out with a number. So how are we going to do this? Well, here are some ways. We could ask people to rate their anxiety on a valid social anxiety scale. That's called self-report. We could count the number of times people avoided social situations over a certain period of time. We could measure heart rate, perspiration, and other physiological indicators of anxiety in social situations. A second example, imagine that you're interested in aggression. Aggression is a feeling, a tendency of behavior that can be manifested in some sort of physical thing, but it could also be manifested just in words or in really subtle things like emails sent. So aggression is hard to measure. How might we measure it? It's a construct. We could do self-report again, ask people to rate their own aggression on a valid aggression scale, but this might not go that well. Sometimes people aren't aware that they're aggressive. We could ask close others to rate that person's tendency toward aggression on a valid aggression scale. Like if the person is aggressive and wishes they were not so aggressive, maybe they would give permission and names of 5 people who are close to them, and those people could rate the aggression of the individual. We could define behaviors that in a certain situation would be deemed aggressive. Like if we created a situation where people could possibly get irritated and angry and possibly aggressive, then what does aggression look like? Maybe it means approaching a person really quickly, or getting into their personal space, or leaning over them. And so then in a lab situation, we could, create the conditions where aggression might arise and have trained observers count aggressive behaviors. Or we could develop what's called a proxy measure for aggression, in which a person, again, is made to maybe feel aggressive toward others and have an opportunity to act on that aggression, but not in a way that would cause harm, like blasting a loud noise at a protected opponent who's not really in the room, and then measuring the volume and duration of the noise blast. More examples. Let's say overconfidence was the concept we wanted to measure. We think it's important to understand it and to understand what causes it. How could we operationalize it? We could measure the difference between how well people think they did on a test and how well they actually did. Or we could measure the difference between where people rank themselves compared to others, like how intelligent are you? And if they say, well, I'm higher than 90% of other people, then we could have them take an intelligence test and find out where they actually rank. Creativity, the way it's typically measured is one of a number of prompts that are given includes giving a person a familiar object or a picture of a familiar object and giving them 3 minutes to write how many uses they can think of for it. And then we look at how original they are and how many they have. Those are numbers. Perception of threat might be measured in physiological responses like higher sweat gland activity, heart rate when they see a threatening image, or maybe reaction times after being presented with threatening images. And customer loyalty might be measured either by customer ratings on a satisfaction questionnaire or records of products purchased by repeat customers in a 3-month period. In other words, how often do they come back? So one of our other students, Stefan, had this question: does attending classes synchronously impact individuals' motivation to do coursework? And we can see we laid out his IV, class modality, synchronous versus asynchronous, and the dependent variable was motivation. And then we started talking about how he might operationalize motivation so that he could count it. And we thought, of course, self-report. We could use a valid scale to measure motivation. But we could also use focus duration. How long is a person focused on their work? And if we used that example, we'd have to really examine what does focus look like. How could we tell if a person is focused? And there might be other ways as well. He'll have to look into the research literature and find out how other people measure motivation and then choose a way. So in order to operationalize concepts, first you have to identify what you wish to study by creating your research question and identifying the main concepts in your question. So if your research question is wondering whether sleep has any impact on anger, your concepts would be sleep and anger. Then you would choose a variable to represent each concept. So sleep is a concept, but a variable, well, you have to figure out what you're going to be measuring. So is it amount of sleep? Is it quality of sleep? If you're measuring anger, well, what is it you're measuring? The number of outbursts, heart rate in a provocative situation, observer ratings of anger. And then you select indicators for the variables. So for sleep, and you're looking at that amount of sleep, maybe your indicator would be average number of hours of sleep per night. If you're looking at quality of sleep, maybe you'd give people a sleep activity tracker, a bracelet or a phone app to track their sleep phases. So wristbands, for example, here. So it's important to operationalize for a few reasons. First off, it makes it possible to measure variables across different contexts. Secondly, if we're looking at systematic empiricism, going back to the first week of the course, remember we have to have observable, measurable findings. And so if we just have a vague idea, oh, we think that music is somehow going to impact painting, that's not empirical. Another person couldn't really measure it. So we have to have some kinds of main tangible things that we're counting or measuring. And that leads us to objectivity. And so if we have a standard approach for collecting data, like we have defined exactly what behaviors we're defining as aggression and we're going to consistently measure those, then we'll maintain that standard of objectivity that's necessary in this quantitative approach. And then reliability, well, that means that our measure, our way of operationalizing our dependent variable can be used by other researchers. If other researchers and us and we ourselves use the same tools, then we have that standardized measure, just like using a ruler to measure a similar concept. There are some limitations. Underdetermination means that many concepts don't mean the same thing across times and social settings. So poverty, it happens all over, and we have an idea of what it means. But if we were going to quantify it in terms of income level, well, that would vary differently, not even just across countries, but even across communities in the US. Secondly, reductiveness, or it reduces this construct to something narrower than what might actually be represented. So they might miss meaningful subjective perceptions of concepts by turning them into numbers. Maybe the effects of the person studying Canal Da, if she kind of reduces the outcomes to these few measurable variables, she's not capturing perhaps the richness of what the ceremony is, the ways that it's benefiting. Or another example, if we ask customers to rate their satisfaction on a 5-point scale, well, we're not really finding much out about why they felt that way or what their experience was. And finally, lack of universality. That means it doesn't apply universally. So if we operationalize a variable, so creativity, let's just say, creativity, and we operationalize it so that it's appropriate for painting, well, we might get the real life experiences of the painter, but then if someone else is measuring creativity and they're talking about creativity in science, then we have two different ways of measuring the same construct that are actually different. So just a couple of mini slides at the end. We're measuring number of sandwiches and the total number of items with something delicious between two pieces of bread. And so now we know how we've defined a sandwich. And this is wrapping up what we have for operational definitions. And I hope it was helpful.